wind had a voice on the high plains, and that afternoon it was speaking in a low, vicious growl. It scraped grit against the single window of Clara Mae Thompson's small house, a sound like 1,000 tiny claws trying to get in. From her porch, the world was a shifting canvas of brown and gray. The distant, jagged peaks of the mountains were completely devoured by the dust storm, and the town of Prairie Ridge, a mile down the trail, was nothing more than a faint smudge against the churning sky. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the wool worn thin, but still a comfort. She was 28, but some days felt she carried the years of a woman twice that age. It was in the permanent set of her shoulders, a defensive posture even when she was alone, and in the quiet of her eyes, which saw more than they ever let on. Her late husband, Jebediah, had been gone 2 years now, but his ghost lingered, not in the house, but in the town's memory of her. He had been a man of smiles and handshakes in the light of day, a pillar of their small community. The town only knew that man. Clara had known the other one, the one who lived behind closed doors, whose voice was a whip and whose hands were stone. When he'd been found at the bottom of a ravine with a broken neck after a night of drinking, the sheriff called it a tragic accident. The town called it something else. They never said the word murder, not to her face, but it hung in the air whenever she passed, a silent accusation that had walled her off from the world. Her flour sack was nearly empty, and the coffee tin held nothing but a few dark grounds. The storm was getting worse, but starvation was a more certain threat than the weather. With a sigh that seemed to pull the weariness from the very floorboards, she braided her dark hair into a tight, practical coil at the nape of her neck, put on Jebediah's old, oversized duster, and went out to the lean-to that served as a barn. Her horse, a steady mare named Patience, nickered softly as she approached. "Just a quick trip, girl," Clara murmured, her voice raspy from disuse. "It cannot be helped." The ride into Prairie Ridge was a battle. The wind tore at her hat, forcing her to hold it down with one hand while the other held the reins. Dust filled her nostrils and coated her tongue with the taste of dry earth. Patience was sure-footed, but even she stumbled once, catching herself with a nervous snort. By the time the blocky shapes of the town's main street became clear through the haze, Clara felt as though she had been scoured clean, inside and out. She tied Patience to the hitching post in front of Abernathy's general store, giving the mare a reassuring pat on the neck. As she stepped onto the boardwalk, the whispers started. It was not a sound so much as a feeling, a sudden ceasing of conversation, a turning of heads, a tightening in the air. 2 women, Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Pritchard, who were just leaving the store, stopped dead in their tracks. They offered no greeting, only a shared look of cold pity and suspicion before they gathered their skirts and hurried away, their heads bent together. Inside, the store smelled of sawdust, cured meats, and judgment. Mr. Abernathy stood behind the counter, polishing a glass jar with a rag. He was a portly man with a fringe of gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He looked up when the bell over the door chimed, and the small, welcoming smile on his face vanished the moment he saw it was her. "Afternoon, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice flat and businesslike. He went back to polishing the jar, his movements slow and deliberate. He was serving a customer, a ranch hand from the Miller's spread, who was counting out coins for a plug of tobacco. The ranch hand glanced at Clara, then quickly looked away, as if her presence might be a contagion. Clara waited. She stood by the counter, her hands folded in front of her, feeling the weight of every silent moment. She knew the game. He would make her wait. He would serve anyone else who came in. He would find small tasks to occupy his time, all to remind her that she was not welcome here. It was a small cruelty, but it was the only kind they could inflict without being openly uncivilized. Finally, the ranch hand pocketed his tobacco, tipped his hat to no one in particular, and left. The store was empty now, save for her and the man behind the counter. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows in their frames. "I need flour," Clara said, her voice steady. "And coffee, a pound of each." "Mr." Abernathy set his jar down with a soft click. He moved with the slow, grudging pace of a man doing a favor he resented. He scooped the flour, weighed it, and tied the sack with brisk, efficient motions. He did the same with the coffee beans, the grinder screaming in the silence of the store. He placed both packages on the counter, well away from her, and stated the price without looking at her. Clara placed the coins on the worn wood, counting them out carefully. Her fingers were trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the strain of holding herself so still, so composed. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. "There is a storm, Mr." Abernathy said, his gaze fixed on a point just over her shoulder. "A bad one. Not safe to be out." It was the closest thing to concern anyone in town had shown her in 2 years, and it was still coated in a thick layer of disapproval. It was not a warning meant for her safety, but a statement of fact that also implied she was foolish for being out at all. "The pantry does not care about the weather," she replied softly. She took her packages and turned to leave. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, stopping her at the door. She turned back. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something human in his eyes, a shadow of the man who had once offered Jebediah a cigar and clapped him on the back. "The Henderson boy found a wolf trap sprung up by the ravine near your property," he said. "Be careful on your way back." It was another warning disguised as a piece of information. The ravine was the place where Jebediah had died. He was reminding her, telling her that the land itself held dangers, and that she was alone to face them. "I am always careful, Mr. Abernathy," she said, and then she was out the door, the little bell announcing her departure with a chime that sounded, to her ears, like a note of relief. The wind was worse now, a physical force that pushed against her as she untied Patience. The sky had turned a bruised shade of purple-brown, and the air was so thick with dust it was hard to draw a full breath. She settled her packages in the saddlebags and pulled herself onto the mare's back, eager for the familiar solitude of her home. The town felt like a cage, its bars made of stares and whispers. The trail home was narrow and winding, skirting the edge of the prairie before dipping down toward the creek that ran alongside her land. The ravine, Mr. Abernathy had spoken of was a deep, jagged scar in the earth to her left, its edges thick with gnarled junipers and loose rock. It was a place she avoided, a place that held the last moments of a life she was still trying to escape. She was halfway home when she first felt it, the unnerving sensation of being watched. She told herself it was the storm, the eerie light, the way the wind made the trees bend and whisper like living things. But the feeling persisted. Patience felt it too. The mare's ears twitched, and her pace faltered. Clara glanced over her shoulder. Through the swirling dust, she saw them, 2 figures on horseback, keeping a steady distance behind her. They were indistinct shapes in the gloom, but their intent felt as sharp and cold as a knife's edge. They were not townsfolk. Their silhouettes were wrong, rougher, more hunched. Drifters, most likely. Men who followed the scent of vulnerability like coyotes tracking a wounded deer. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the calm she had so carefully constructed. Her heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She urged Patience into a trot, then a canter. The sound of hoofbeats behind her quickened to match her pace. They were closing the distance. Her small house was just visible on the rise ahead, a promise of sanctuary that seemed a lifetime away. The ravine gaped to her left. She had no choice but to ride on. Panic began to cloud her thoughts. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. One of the men spurred his horse, pulling up alongside her. He was a gaunt figure with a grimy face and a yellow-toothed grin that held no humor. The other man cut in front, blocking the path. Patience reared, whinnying in terror. "Well now, look what we got here," the first man said. his voice a gravelly rasp. He reached out and grabbed Patience's bridle, bringing the terrified mare to a halt. A pretty little thing all alone in a storm. "What do you want?" Clara's voice was a thin thread of sound, but it did not waver. "Just a bit of conversation," the second man said. Dismounting, he was bigger than the first, with a brutish face and small, greedy eyes that roamed over her. "And maybe whatever you got in them saddlebags, and whatever coins you got in your pockets, take it," Clara said, her hands held up in a gesture of surrender. "Take the supplies. I have no money." The first man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I think you are lying, Missy. We will just have to check for ourselves." The bigger man started toward her, his intentions clear in the cruel twist of his lips. He was not just after her supplies. The air thickened with a menace that went beyond robbery. This was a different kind of violation, a primal threat that made the skin on her arms crawl. She was trapped. The town that shunned her was too far to help, and the God she sometimes prayed to felt 1,000,000 miles away. Just as the man reached for her leg to pull her from the saddle, another sound cut through the howling wind. It was not the storm, and it was not the horses. It was the cold, metallic double-click of a revolver being cocked. "I would advise against that," a voice said, low and steady. It came from the ridge overlooking the trail. Everyone froze. Through the dust, a figure emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, sitting atop a powerful buckskin horse. He was a silhouette against the dark sky, a rifle held loosely in one hand and a Colt Peacemaker in the other, its barrel aimed squarely at the chest of the man standing beside her. "Who in the hell are you?" the first drifter snarled, his hand inching toward the pistol on his own hip. "The man who is telling you to let the lady go," the stranger said. His voice was calm, without tremor or bluster, which made it all the more menacing. The drifter's hand made its move, a blur of motion, but the stranger was faster. A deafening crack echoed through the ravine, and the man grabbing her bridle cried out, clutching a hand that was suddenly slick with blood. He stared at it in disbelief, his grimy face pale with shock. The second man, the larger one, had drawn his own weapon, but he hesitated, his eyes wide. The stranger's revolver was now leveled at him. "Drop it," the stranger commanded, "or the next one goes through your eye." For a long second, the man weighed his chances. He looked at the stranger's unyielding posture, at the unwavering barrel of the gun, at his partner groaning and cursing beside him. He made his choice. His pistol thudded to the ground. "Now get on your horse," the stranger continued, his voice never rising. "And ride, you," he said, nodding toward the wounded man. "You go with him. Do not stop, and do not look back. If I ever see either of you near this town or this woman again, I will not be so gracious." The unwounded man scrambled back onto his horse, hauling his bleeding companion up behind him. They kicked their weary mounts into a gallop and disappeared back down the trail, swallowed by the dust and the growing darkness. Silence descended, broken only by the wind and the heavy, frightened breathing of Clara's mare. The stranger did not lower his gun until the sound of the drifter's hoofbeats had completely faded. He dismounted, his movements economical and sure. He was tall, with the lean, hard build of a man who spent his life in the saddle. His face, shadowed by the brim of a sweat-stained hat, was rugged and weathered, with a square jaw covered in dark stubble. He looked tired, like he had been on the trail for a very long time. He walked over and picked up the drifter's discarded pistol, tucking it into his belt before turning his attention to her. His eyes were a startlingly clear gray, and they held a weary sort of kindness. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked. Clara could only nod. The adrenaline that had kept her rigid was now draining away, leaving a tremor in its wake. Her hands, still clutching the reins, were shaking uncontrollably. But the calm she had learned to build around herself like a fortress held firm. She would not cry. She would not faint. She had survived Jebediah. She would survive this. "I am," she managed to say, her voice stronger than she expected. "Thank you." "My name is Eli," he said, as if it were an afterthought. He holstered his revolver. "Just passing through." "Clara," she replied. She slid down from Patience's back, wanting the solid ground beneath her feet. But as her boot touched the earth, a sharp pain shot up her leg, and her ankle gave way. She cried out, a small, sharp sound of pain, and would have fallen if he had not moved with surprising speed to catch her. His hands were strong and steady on her arms, holding her upright. She could feel the solid warmth of him through her duster, could smell the scent of leather, dust, and something else, the clean, sharp smell of the open range. The contact was jarring. It had been years since a man had touched her with anything but violence or condemnation. "Your ankle," he said, his voice gentle. "It is twisted," she said, biting her lip against the pain. "I can walk. My house is just over that rise." She tried to put weight on it again, but the pain was too intense. A wave of dizziness washed over her. It was the final indignity, to be strong in the face of mortal danger, only to be felled by a simple misstep. Eli looked at her, then at the darkening path, then back at her stubborn, pain-filled eyes. "No, ma'am, I do not think you can," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Before she could protest, he bent down, sliding one arm beneath her knees and the other around her back. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all. The shock of it stole her breath. To be held this way, carried with such effortless care, was so foreign an experience it felt like a dream. She instinctively stiffened, her hands coming to rest uncertainly on his shoulders. "I can manage," she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "I am sure you can," he said, his voice rumbling in his chest, so close to her ear. "But you do not have to." He walked with a long, steady stride, carrying her as he led both their horses up the trail. Clara was silent, her head resting against the rough wool of his coat. She watched the landscape pass by in a blur of twilight and dust, acutely aware of the steady beat of his heart against her back, of the strength in the arms that held her. For the first time in a very long time, she felt something other than fear or loneliness. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, and she did not yet have a name for it, but it felt impossibly like safety. By the time they reached her house, full dark had fallen. Eli set her down gently on the porch swing, his touch careful. The pain in her ankle was a throbbing, insistent thing now. Inside, she lit a kerosene lamp, the warm glow pushing back the shadows and revealing the sparse, clean interior of her home. It was a simple place, but it was hers. Eli waited on the porch, a silent, imposing figure in the gloom. He attended to the horses, stripping their saddles and rubbing them down with a practiced efficiency that spoke of a long acquaintance with the work. "I will need to look at that ankle," he said from the doorway. He was not asking for permission. Clara hesitated. Letting him into her home felt like a monumental concession, a breach of the walls she had so carefully erected. But the throbbing in her ankle was undeniable, and the memory of what had happened on the trail was still raw. "All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He came inside, bringing the cold night air with him. He knelt before her and, with surprising gentleness, worked her boot off. Her ankle was already swollen and turning a dark shade of purple. He examined it with knowledgeable fingers, his touch firm but not painful. "It is a bad sprain, but not broken," he announced. He went to the water pump, filled a basin, and found a clean rag in her dry sink. He wrapped her ankle in the cold, wet cloth, his movements deft and focused. He worked in silence, and she watched him, this stranger who had appeared out of a dust storm like some avenging spirit. He was not like the men in town, with their assessing glances and hidden judgments. He simply saw a problem and fixed it. When he was done, he stood up, his height seeming to fill the small room. "Those men," he said, his voice low. "They might come back." The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. "They would not dare." "Men like that, their pride is as big as their greed," he said. "I wounded one of them. That makes it personal." He picked up his rifle, which he had leaned against the doorframe. "I will stay on your porch for the night, just to be sure." Clara stared at him. She owed him her life, or at least her well-being. And yet the idea of his continued presence was deeply unsettling. But the alternative, spending the night alone, listening to every creak of the floorboards, every howl of the wind, was worse. "You do not have to do that," she said, the protest a matter of habit. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "I do." She relented with a small, weary nod, while he settled himself in a chair on the porch, his rifle across his lap. She put the kettle on the wood stove. Her hands were still shaking, but her movements were steady. When the water boiled, she made 2 cups of strong, black tea. She carried one out to him, her injured ankle forcing her into a slow, awkward hop. He took the cup from her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. A jolt, small but distinct, passed between them. She sat down on the porch swing, wrapping her hands around the warmth of her own cup. The fire in her stove cast a flickering orange light through the window, illuminating the space between them. The wind had begun to die down, its growl softening to a mournful sigh. They sat in silence for a long time, the quiet not awkward, but filled with a heavy, unspoken weight. He did not ask her name again, or what a woman was doing living all alone out here. He did not ask about her husband or her past, or why the town treated her like a pariah. He asked nothing at all. He just sat, a watchful guardian in the darkness, and drank his tea. Clara noticed it, this deliberate absence of questions. It was a courtesy so profound, so unexpected, that it felt like a gift. Every other person she met wanted to peel back her layers, to look for the rot they were so sure was hidden underneath. This man simply accepted her presence as she was. In this moment, he had seen her at her most vulnerable and had not tried to take anything from her. He had, in fact, given her something back, a sense of security she had forgotten existed. Finally, the chill of the night began to seep into her bones. The tea was gone, and the fire inside would soon need another log. She stood up, balancing carefully on her good foot. "Thank you," she said again. The words felt inadequate for what he had done. "For everything." He just nodded, his gray eyes watching her from the shadows. "Get some rest, Clara." She turned to go inside, to close the door and leave him to his vigil in the cold, but she stopped, her hand on the doorframe. The house suddenly felt too empty, the lock on the door too flimsy. The silence within its walls promised not peace, but a breeding ground for fear. She thought of waking from a nightmare to find herself utterly alone, with only the memory of those men's greedy eyes for company. She turned back to him. He was a stranger, a man with a gun and a past he was not talking about. Every instinct she had honed over years of pain and betrayal told her to lock the door and trust no one. But another, deeper instinct, one she had thought long dead, urged her to do the opposite. Her voice, when she spoke, was so quiet it was nearly carried away by the wind. "Would you mind staying inside, just until morning, just in case?" Clara awoke to the smell of coffee and the soft crackle of a fire. For a disoriented moment, she thought she had dreamed the entire ordeal, the dust storm, the men on the trail, the sharp, searing pain in her ankle. But the dull throb in her leg was real. And so was the sight of the tall stranger sitting in the chair by her hearth. Eli was awake, though he had not been sleeping. He sat with his back to her, staring into the flames, a tin cup of coffee held in his hands. His rifle was not across his lap anymore, but leaned carefully against the stone of the fireplace, within easy reach. He had not taken her bed, nor even the cot in the corner. He had kept his vigil in the chair all night, a silent, unmoving guardian. The morning light, pale and thin after the storm, filtered through the window and outlined his broad shoulders, making him seem like a permanent fixture in her small, quiet home. He was respectfully distant, a man who understood boundaries, yet his very presence was a shield. The house did not feel empty or haunted. It felt watched over. She tried to sit up without a sound, but the slight rustle of her bedding made him turn his head. His gray eyes met hers, and there was no surprise in them, only a calm acknowledgement. "Morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. "There is coffee on the stove." "Thank you," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. Pride, or perhaps just a long-ingrained habit of self-reliance, made her try to go about her day as if nothing were different. She swung her good leg out of bed and reached for the crutch Jebediah had made years ago for a ranch hand with a broken leg, an object she had kept in a back closet, never imagining she would need it herself. Leaning on it heavily, she made her way to the stove. The simple act of pouring a cup of coffee was an awkward, precarious ballet. She saw him watch her, his body tensed as if to catch her if she fell, but he did not move to help. He let her try. He was giving her that dignity, at least. But dignity could not draw water from a well or carry feed to the animals. After a few minutes of watching her struggle to fill a bucket at the pump, her face pale with the effort, he wordlessly stood up. He took the bucket from her hand, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. He did not say, "Let me," or "You cannot do that." He simply took the bucket and walked out the door. Clara watched him from the porch, leaning against a post for support. He moved with an unhurried, powerful grace. He worked the pump with long, easy strokes, filling the bucket and carrying it to the horse trough without spilling a drop. He found the sack of oats in the lean-to and gave Patience her morning ration, murmuring something soft to the mare that made her nicker in response. He scattered feed for the handful of chickens that scratched in the dirt near the coop. He did it all with a quiet efficiency that suggested this was the rhythm of his life. Wake, work, survive. He did not seem to be doing her a favor. He was just doing what needed to be done. As she watched him, a memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. It was of another man doing these same chores. Jebediah had always made a great show of his work. He would come inside, stamping the mud from his boots, his voice booming as he spoke of his hard day, expecting praise, demanding attention. He worked for an audience, even if that audience was only her. Jebediah had been a handsome man, with a charming smile that won over everyone in Prairie Ridge. He was praised from the pulpit as a good husband and a pillar of the community, a man who always had a kind word and a helping hand for a neighbor. The town saw the man who tipped his hat to the ladies and bought candy for the children at Abernathy's store. Clara saw the man who came home late, the smell of whiskey on his breath. His charm curdled into a dark and unpredictable rage. She remembered one night, not long before he died, when she had accidentally broken a dish while washing up. It had been one of his mother's. He had not yelled. The silence that followed the shatter was far worse. He had walked over to her, his face a cold mask, and picked up a shard of the blue-patterned china. "You are a clumsy woman, Clara," he had said, his voice deceptively soft, careless. "You do not value the things I provide for you." He had held the shard up to the lamplight. "My mother loved these plates. They were fine things. And you are not a fine thing at all, are you?" He had traced the sharp edge of the shard along her cheek, never breaking the skin, but the threat was as clear as a blade at her throat. She had stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs, until he had finally tossed the piece into the trash and walked away, leaving her trembling in the sudden, ringing silence. His death had been a release, a terrifying, guilty freedom. The sheriff had questioned her, his eyes full of a tired suspicion. She had told the truth. Jebediah had been drinking heavily at the saloon, He had stormed out after an argument over cards, and she had not seen him again until his body was found the next day. It was a plausible story, but it was not the whole story. The relief on her face must have been too plain, her grief too shallow. The whispers started almost immediately, cultivated and spread by Jebediah's sister, Beatrice. Clara became the quiet widow, the strange woman on the edge of town, the one who might have gotten away with murder. "Your ankle needs a fresh wrap." Eli's voice pulled her from the memory. He was standing in front of her, holding out the basin of cold water. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were steady on hers, and she had the unsettling feeling that he could see the ghosts she was wrestling with. She nodded and hobbled back inside, letting him tend to the injury as he had the night before. They ate breakfast in silence, the last of her bacon and 2 eggs from her hens, which he had collected and cooked. He ate like he worked, with a clean economy of motion, wasting nothing. "You cannot stay," she said suddenly, the words coming out before she could stop them. It was a statement of fact, not a command. He looked up from his plate, his expression unchanged. He chewed his food slowly before answering, "I know." "Where will you go?" The question was more personal than anything she had yet asked, and she immediately felt she had crossed a line. He seemed to consider it for a moment, wiping his plate clean with the last piece of bread. "Onward," he said finally. "I am not staying in Prairie Ridge long." He looked out the window, his gaze distant. "I am just drifting, trying to outrun something, I suppose." He did not elaborate, and she did not ask. She understood. They were 2 people running from things that could not be outrun. His past, as unsaid as hers, was unspoken. The knowledge created a strange, fragile kinship between them. The next morning, Eli was gone before the sun was fully up. He had left a neat stack of chopped firewood by the door, and the water buckets were full. The house felt cavernous in his absence, the silence returning not as peace, but as a hollow ache. Clara felt a pang of something she refused to name as disappointment. It was better this way, she told herself. Safer. A man like that brought his own kind of trouble. She was right. The trouble arrived 2 days later, when she was well enough to make her way to the community well at the edge of town. It was closer than her own, and the water was sweeter. As she approached, she saw a small group of women gathered there, including Mrs. Gable and Jebediah's sister, Beatrice. The moment they saw her, their chatter stopped. A curtain of silence and hostility fell over the group. Beatrice detached herself from the others and walked toward Clara, her arms crossed over her chest. She was a thin, severe woman with Jebediah's sharp features and none of his charm. Her eyes were small and hard, like chips of flint. "Clara," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "I heard you had some trouble on the trail." The news had traveled, as all news did in Prairie Ridge. "I am fine, Beatrice," Clara said, keeping her voice even. "So I see," Beatrice said, her eyes raking over Clara with unconcealed contempt. Then she leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss that was loud enough for the other women to hear. "Martha Gable saw a man's horse tied outside your house at dawn the other morning. She said he was a stranger. You must have been very frightened indeed to require a man's protection all through the night." The insinuation was as thick and foul as swamp mud. Beatrice was painting a picture for her audience, the lonely, morally suspect widow, inviting a strange man into her home, into her bed. "He saved me from 2 men who would have done me great harm," Clara said, her cheeks burning. "He was a gentleman." Beatrice let out a short, sharp laugh. "Oh, I am sure he was. You always did have a taste for gentlemen who passed through, did you not? Just like you did when my poor brother was still alive. It is a wonder you do not get lonely out there all by yourself. But it seems you have found a way to manage." The words were a slap in the face. The old, baseless rumors of her infidelity, rumors Jebediah himself had started in his drunken rages, were being given new life. Clara stood frozen, the wooden bucket handle digging into her palm. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, to claw the smug, cruel look off Beatrice's face. But she knew it was pointless. They had already judged her. Anything she said would only be twisted into further proof of her guilt. Without a word, she turned and walked away, leaving her bucket behind. The sound of the women's renewed, excited whispering followed her all the way home. She slammed her front door and leaned against it, her body trembling with a rage that had no outlet. The town had built a prison of suspicion around her, and Beatrice was its most diligent warden. Despite the ugliness of the gossip, or perhaps because of it, Clara found her thoughts turning more and more to Eli. His quiet strength was a stark contrast to the town's loud, petty cruelty. He had protected her without asking for anything in return. He had respected her silence. He had seen her pain and had not flinched from it. She found herself drawn to the memory of his steadfast presence, a solid rock in the churning sea of her life. A few days later, as another storm front began to blow in, the wind caught the cracked pane of her kitchen window and finally shattered it. Glass sprayed across the floor. The wind immediately began to howl through the opening, tearing at the curtains. She managed to board it up with a piece of scrap wood, but it was a temporary fix at best. She needed a new pane of glass, which meant a trip to town and another round of cold stares and whispered insults. She was standing there, contemplating the miserable task, when she heard the sound of a horse. Her heart leaped into her throat. She peered out the front window and saw him. Eli was riding up the trail on his buckskin, leading a pack mule behind him. He dismounted and walked to her door, his hat in his hand. He looked weary, his face caked with dust from the trail, but his gray eyes were as clear and steady as ever. "I was in the next county over," he said, by way of explanation. "Heard the storm took a turn for the worse. Figured you might need a hand with that window." He nodded toward the boarded-up opening. In his other hand, he held a perfectly cut pane of glass, carefully wrapped in burlap. Clara was speechless. He had come back. He had thought of her. Yes, she finally stammered. "Thank you." They worked on the window together. He showed her how to carefully chip away the old, dried putty. She handed him the tools he needed. They moved in a comfortable, unspoken rhythm, the small space of the kitchen bringing them into close proximity. His sleeve brushed her arm. She could feel the heat of his body when he leaned close to set the new pane in place. The air between them grew thick and charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the work. As he was nailing the final wooden brace in place, his hand slipped and he drove a long, thin splinter of wood deep into the palm of his other hand. He swore softly under his breath and tried to pull it out with his teeth, his brow furrowed in frustration. "Let me," Clara said, her voice quiet. He stopped, looking at her. He hesitated for a moment. Then slowly, he held out his hand. She took it in both of hers. His hand was large and rough, calloused from years of reins and ropes and hard labor. Hers were small against it. She led him to the table and made him sit, then fetched her sewing basket, with a pair of tweezers and a needle. She began the delicate work of extracting the splinter. She worked with intense concentration, her touch as light as a feather. She was aware of his stillness, of his gaze on her bent head, of the warmth of his skin against hers. The world seemed to shrink to this single point of contact, her gentle, careful fingers on his strong, wounded hand. When she finally pulled the splinter free, a single drop of blood welled up on his palm. She wiped it away with the corner of her apron. He did not pull his hand away. Instead, his fingers curled slightly, almost grasping hers. "You have a gentle touch," he said, his voice rough. They sat like that for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, filled with unspoken things. That night, she made a stew for supper. As they sat by the fire, the wind rattling the newly repaired window, she found herself talking. She told him small things, fragments of her life. She spoke of her mother, who had taught her to garden, of the books she loved to read, of the loneliness of the long winters. She did not speak of Jebediah, but she spoke of the life that had existed before him and the one that was trying to exist after him. He listened, his gaze never leaving her face, his quiet attention a balm to her soul. When it was time to retire, the question of where he would sleep hung in the air. He started to rise, presumably to head for the porch, but she spoke before he could move. "You can stay inside again," she said. "The floor by the fire is warm." It was not a question, but a quiet statement. He nodded, accepting it without comment. Later, as she was banking the fire for the night, she noticed a smaller, finer splinter still lodged in the soft skin of her own hand, a casualty of the window repair. She tried to get it with her fingernails, but it was too deep. Eli, seeing her struggle, came over. "Here," he said softly. He knelt in front of her chair and took her hand in his. It was a mirror of the scene from the afternoon, but this time it felt infinitely more intimate. The firelight cast flickering shadows on his face, softening the hard lines and making his eyes seem darker, deeper. He took her hand as if it were made of spun glass, his touch impossibly careful. He used his pocket knife, the tip of the blade precise and steady, and in a moment, the tiny sliver of wood was gone. He did not let go of her hand. He held it, his thumb stroking softly across her knuckles. It was a simple, comforting gesture, but for Clara, it was a revelation. Every touch she had known from a man for years had been about ownership, about power, about taking. This was different. This was giving. It was a touch that asked for nothing. A tremor ran through her, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. He saw it, and his expression softened into something she could not name, but it made her heart ache. He lifted her hand and gently pressed his lips to the spot where the splinter had been. The feeling of his mouth on her skin, warm and soft, shattered the last of her composure. A sob escaped her, a sound of pain and release that had been locked away for years. She looked at him, at this quiet, gentle stranger who had shown her more kindness in 2 days than she had known in 6 years of marriage. She reached out her other hand, her fingers trembling, and touched his rough cheek. A current passed between them, a spark of undeniable desire that was intertwined with gratitude and a desperate, aching loneliness. She leaned forward, her voice a ragged whisper, the words an admission of a truth she had forgotten was possible. "No one's ever touched me this gently." The morning after his return, the swelling in Clara's ankle had worsened, the skin a tight, angry purple, though she tried to hide her winces of pain. Eli saw them. He watched her hobble from the stove to the table, her face a pale mask of determination. After they had finished their breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, he stood up, his decision made. "I am riding into town," he announced, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "There is a poultice the doctor can mix up. It will draw out the swelling." Clara opened her mouth to protest, to tell him he did not need to, that she could manage. But the words died on her lips. The truth was, she could not manage. The pain was a constant, grinding presence, and she was tired of fighting it alone. More than that, the thought of him leaving, of the house returning to its hollow silence, filled her with a dread she did not want to examine too closely. "All right," she said softly, looking down at her hands. "But be careful. Eli, the people in that town, they talk." He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "I have dealt with talk before." He rode out on his buckskin, leaving the pack mule to graze in Clara's small pasture. The air was clean and sharp after the recent storms, and the sky was a vast, brilliant blue. But as the drab buildings of Prairie Ridge came into view, the brightness seemed to dim. Eli felt a familiar tightening in his gut, the feeling he always got when entering a place where judgment was the local currency. He went to Abernathy's general store first, needing to replenish the coffee he had used. The store was empty save for Mr. Abernathy and 2 older ranchers. Silas Croft and Martin Fletcher, who were leaning against the counter, nursing cups of coffee. They fell silent the moment Eli walked in, their eyes sizing him up with the practiced suspicion of small-town men. Eli ignored them, walking to the back of the store to find the coffee beans. As he was scooping them into a sack, he heard their voices start up again, low and conspiratorial. "That is him," Martin Fletcher murmured, his voice a dry rustle. "The one Martha Gables saw leaving the widow's place." "Looks like a rough customer," Silas Croft replied, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "Figures she would take up with his kind. Never was right, that one. Too quiet. Still waters. You know. My wife says Beatrice is telling everyone the woman invited him right into her bed," Martin added, a note of salacious glee in his voice. "Just like she did with that peddler the year before Jebediah broke his neck. Cursed. I tell you, that ravine of hers is cursed, and she is the reason why." Eli's hand tightened on the metal scoop, his knuckles turning white. He could feel the familiar, hot surge of anger building in his chest, a rage that was always simmering just beneath the surface. It was the same blind, stupid talk that had condemned his brother, gossip hardening into fact, suspicion becoming a verdict without a trial. He finished with the coffee, his movement stiff, and walked to the counter. He placed the sack and a few coins on the wood with a solid thud. "Mr. Abernathy scurried over, refusing to meet his eye. The two ranchers fell silent again, but their smug, knowing looks were louder than any words. Eli stared at them both, his gray eyes as cold and hard as river stones, until they shuffled their feet and found a sudden interest in the contents of a pickle barrel. He left the store and went to the doctor's office, a small clapboard building next to the saloon. The doctor was an old man with shaky hands and glasses thick as bottle bottoms, but he knew his herbs. Eli bought the poultice and a roll of clean bandages, then paused on the boardwalk outside. The anger was still coiling inside him, a venom with nowhere to go. He needed a drink. It was a fool's errand. He knew to seek solace in a bottle, but the saloon's dark, smoky interior was a magnet for the darkness in his own soul. The saloon was dim and smelled of stale beer, sweat, and sawdust. A few men were scattered at the tables, playing cards. A handful of others stood at the bar. Eli ordered a whiskey and downed it in one smooth motion, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction. He ordered another, intending to drink it slowly. He had just raised the glass when Silas Croft, the rancher from the store, bellied up to the bar beside him. The man was emboldened now, with the whiskey he had been drinking and the support of his friends. "You are the fella staying out at the Thompson place, ain't you?" Silas asked, his voice overly loud. Eli did not look at him. He stared at his own reflection in the grimy mirror behind the bar. "What if I am?" "Just some friendly advice," Silas said, leaning closer, his breath sour with tobacco. "I would not get too comfortable out there if I were you. That woman, she is bad luck. A black widow, men who get too close to her. They do not last long. Just ask Jebediah." He let out a wet, wheezing laugh. That was it. The final straw. The casual, cruel slander. The smug laughter that dismissed a woman's pain and a man's death as a piece of entertaining gossip. Eli's control snapped. He did not say a word. He simply set his glass down with a soft click, turned, and drove his right fist into Silas Croft's jaw. The punch was short, hard, and clean. There was a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage, and Silas went down like a sack of grain, landing in a heap on the filthy floor, unconscious before he even hit. The saloon went dead silent. Every eye was on Eli. For a moment, he thought the other men might rush him, but they seemed frozen, caught off guard by the sudden, brutal efficiency of the violence. Eli looked down at the man on the floor, then let his cold gaze sweep over the other stunned faces in the room. He felt no satisfaction, only the same old bitter, empty rage. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving his second whiskey untouched on the bar. The ride back to Clara's was a blur of churning emotions. The wind whipped at his face, but it could not cool the fire inside him. He was angry at Silas, at the whole town, at a world that was so quick to judge and condemn. But beneath it all, he was angry at himself. He had let his temper get the best of him, had brought violence into a situation that was already volatile. He had likely just made everything 10 times worse for Clara. When he reached the house, she was on the porch, watching for him. The relief that washed over her face when she saw him was quickly replaced by a look of concern. He dismounted, and as he stepped into the light, she saw it. A dark, ugly bruise was already forming high on his right cheekbone, and his knuckles were raw and split. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "Nothing," he said, brushing past her to go inside. "Man's horse kicked him. I was just standing too close when he went down." It was a clumsy lie, and they both knew it. She followed him inside and closed the door. She stood there, her arms crossed, her jaw set in a stubborn line. "Eli, do not lie to me." He set the medicine on the table and turned to face her. His shoulders slumped in defeat. He looked into her eyes, and he saw not accusation, but a deep, knowing sorrow. She had seen this before. She knew the look of a man who carried violence with him. The realization shamed him. "I was in the saloon," he said, his voice low and rough. "A man was talking. About you. I told him to stop." "You hit him," she stated. It was not a question. He nodded, unable to look at her. "I did." She was silent for a long time. He expected her to be angry, to tell him to leave, to accuse him of making things worse. Instead, when she spoke, her voice was soft with a pain that went far beyond the current situation. "The rage," she said, almost to herself. "It is not just about me, is it?" He looked up, startled. She saw it. She saw past the anger of the moment to the older, deeper well of fury he carried inside him. No one had ever seen that before. People saw him as quiet or dangerous, or just another drifting cowboy. But she saw the source of the poison. That evening, a storm rolled in from the mountains, the sky turning a bruised gray-green. The wind moaned around the corners of the small house, and rain began to lash against the windows. They sat by the fire, the unspoken tension from the afternoon still lingering in the air. Eli had applied the poultice to her ankle, his touch as gentle as ever, but a wall had gone up between them. Clara was the one who finally broke the silence. "Tell me," she said, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Tell me what puts that look in your eyes." Eli was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. He stared into the fire as if seeing something else in the embers, a memory playing out in the heat and light. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, scraped raw with an old grief. "I had a brother," he began, "younger than me. His name was Daniel. He was a good kid, a bit wild, maybe, but his heart was in the right place. He never hurt a soul that did not deserve it." He paused, taking a slow, deep breath before continuing. "We were working a cattle drive down in the Texas Panhandle. Daniel got into a card game with the trail boss, a man named Henderson. Henderson was a cheat and a bully, and when Daniel called him on it, a fight broke out. Henderson pulled a knife. Daniel just defended himself. But in the scuffle, the knife went into Henderson's gut. He was dead before he hit the floor. The fire popped, spitting a shower of sparks up the chimney. The rain beat a steady, hypnotic rhythm on the roof. There were witnesses," Eli went on, his voice hardening. "They all saw that Henderson drew first, but Henderson had family in that county. Important family. They wanted someone to pay. The sheriff was in their pocket, and the judge was a drunk. They called it murder. They held a trial that was a joke. The witnesses were scared off or paid off. My brother, he never stood a chance." Clara listened, her heart aching for the story he was telling, and for the man who was telling it. She could see the scene as if she were there, the dusty courtroom, the lies, the look of betrayal on a young man's face. "I tried to stop it," Eli said, his voice thick with self-loathing. "I testified. I hired a lawyer with the last of our money. I even tried to break him out the night before, but I was too late." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a haunted, desolate emptiness. "They hanged him at dawn. I watched them do it. He was 20 years old." He fell silent. The story was finished, but its ghost filled the room. Clara finally understood. His rootless drifting, his distrust of people, his violent reaction to injustice, it was all born of that one horrific moment. He was not just outrunning something. He was chasing a ghost, trying to find a way to right a wrong that could never be undone. "I have been drifting ever since," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I cannot stay in one place for too long. People, laws, they are not what they seem. I do not trust them. I do not trust any of it." Clara reached out and placed her hand on his arm. He did not pull away. They sat there for a long time, two solitary souls in a storm, finding a strange comfort in the geography of their shared wounds. Later that night, the storm intensified. Thunder rattled the little house to its foundations, and lightning bleached the world white for a split second at a time. Clara had fallen into a fitful sleep in her bed, but a particularly loud clap of thunder jolted her awake. She sat bolt upright, her heart pounding, the phantom sensation of a heavy hand on her shoulder and a cruel voice whispering in her ear still clinging to her like a shroud. The nightmare. It was always the same one. She was trembling, the fear from the dream mingling with the violence of the storm outside. The darkness in the room felt suffocating. She needed light. She needed to know she was not alone. She grabbed her crutch and made her way into the main room. Eli was not on his bedroll by the fire. He was sitting in the chair, a book open on his lap, a single kerosene lamp burning on the table beside him. He had been reading, or perhaps just keeping watch. He looked up as she entered, his face shadowed and unreadable in the lamplight. "The storm wake you?" he asked softly. She could only nod, wrapping her arms around herself to still the shaking. She could not bring herself to go back to the cold, empty bed. She hobbled over to the hearth and sank down onto the rug before the fire, pulling her thin nightgown tighter around her knees. Eli said nothing. He simply closed his book, marking his page with a strip of leather, and watched her. After a moment, he reached over and took her hand. His grasp was warm and solid, an anchor in the storm, both inside and out. He held it, his thumb making slow, soothing circles on the back of her own. They sat like that, listening to the rain, the silence between them a living thing. Her trembling slowly subsided, but the ghost of the nightmare remained. The scars that no one could see were burning beneath her skin. She looked at this man who had shared his own deep wound with her, who had shown her his own scars. She felt a sudden, desperate need to do the same, to show him the truth of her own prison. It was a terrifying gamble. He might be disgusted. He might pity her, which would be worse. Or he might just see her. Her fingers, cold and clumsy, went to the top button of her high-necked cotton nightgown. She undid it, then the next, and the next. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She was more afraid in this moment than she had been on the trail facing two armed men. Eli watched her, his expression still, his eyes never leaving hers. He did not move, did not speak. He simply waited. She pulled the fabric of her nightgown aside, baring her left shoulder to the firelight. There, stark against the pale skin, was a latticework of old scars, a pale, silvery tracery from the thin edge of a belt buckle, a puckered, ugly mark where a smoldering cigar had been pressed against her skin in a drunken rage. They were the map of her marriage, the testament to Jebediah's private cruelties. She finally met Eli's gaze, her own eyes swimming with unshed tears. "You saved me once," she whispered, her voice cracking. But this is the part no one wants to see. He looked at the scars. His jaw tightened, and a muscle flexed, the only outward sign of the emotion that was moving through him. She braced herself for the flinch of revulsion, the look of pity. It never came. Slowly, reverently, he released her hand and reached out. His calloused, work-roughened fingers traced the largest of the scars. His touch so light it was barely there. It was not a touch of pity. It was a touch of awe, of reverence, as if he were touching something sacred. He was not seeing ugliness. He was seeing a testament to what she had survived. He leaned forward, his face close to hers, and he gently kissed the puckered mark on her shoulder. Then he kissed the one next to it, and the one after that. Each kiss was a soft, warm benediction, a silent apology for the pain of the world, a promise of safety. A choked sob broke from Clara's throat. The walls she had built around her heart, the fortress of calm composure she had maintained for years, crumbled into dust. The tears came then, a hot, cleansing flood, washing away years of unspeakable pain and shame. She broke down completely, her body shaking with the force of her grief. She reached for him, her hands trembling as they clutched at the rough fabric of his shirt. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest as she wept. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He just held her, his hands stroking her hair, his solid presence a bulwark against the storm, against the memories, against the world. Eventually, her sobs subsided into ragged, exhausted breaths. She did not pull away. She could not. She was too tired, too raw, too vulnerable. She simply rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. They fell asleep like that, right there on the rug in front of the dying fire. He was still sitting in the chair, and she was curled in his lap, wrapped in his arms, her head tucked beneath his chin. They were both still fully clothed, a tangle of limbs and shared warmth. There were no more words. There was only the sound of the rain on the roof, the whisper of the wind, and the quiet, steady rhythm of two broken people breathing in unison, finding a fragile, unspoken trust in the dark. They awoke on the floor by the cold hearth, tangled in a way that felt both strange and profoundly natural. Clara was the first to stir, her head still resting on Eli's chest, his arm a heavy, protective weight around her. For a moment, she did not move, allowing herself the simple, stolen luxury of the feeling. The morning light was soft, filtering through the window and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The house was utterly still. It was the first time she had woken in this home without the immediate, reflexive clenching of fear in her stomach. She eased herself away from him gently, careful not to wake him. He looked younger in sleep. The hard lines of his face softened, the weary tension gone from his shoulders. She moved stiffly, her ankle a dull, persistent ache, and rekindled the fire, her movements quiet and practiced. As she set the coffee pot on the stove, she felt his eyes on her. She turned, and he was awake, watching her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. There was a new knowledge in his gaze, a shared vulnerability that had not been there the day before. "Morning," he said, his voice husky with sleep. "Morning," she replied, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. The day began in this new, fragile quiet. They moved around each other with a careful, unspoken awareness. The wall between them had been breached, but the ground they now stood on was unfamiliar, and they trod upon it with caution. The air was thick with things unsaid, with the raw emotion of the night before still clinging to the very fabric of the room. It was mid-morning when the sound of hoofbeats broke the peace. It was a single rider, approaching at a steady, purposeful trot. Clara went to the window, her hand instinctively going to her throat. Eli was instantly on his feet, his posture shifting from relaxed to wary in a heartbeat. He moved to the door, his hand resting on the Colt at his hip. The rider was a stout man with a thick gray mustache and a weary set to his shoulders. He wore a dusty coat and a silver star pinned to his vest, but it was not the star of Prairie Ridge. He pulled his horse to a halt in front of the house and surveyed the property with a calm, assessing gaze before dismounting. "Stay inside," Eli said to her in a low voice. Then he stepped out onto the porch, letting the screen door swing shut behind him. "Morning," the lawman called out, his voice a practical baritone. "Looking for the Thompson residence." "This is it," Eli replied, his stance relaxed but his eyes sharp. "What is your business here?" "I am Sheriff Brody, from Willow Creek County," the man said, walking closer but stopping at the bottom of the porch steps, a respectful distance away. "A couple of my men found a body down in a dry wash about 5 miles east of here, shot in the back. We identified him as a drifter named Carl Slocum. We found his partner, a fellow with a wounded hand, and he told us quite a story. Said they had an altercation out here a few days back, with a woman named Clara Thompson and a man who fits your description." Clara, listening from behind the door, felt the blood drain from her face. A body. Shot. The coffee pot on the stove suddenly seemed 1,000 miles away. The fragile piece of the morning shattered into 1,000,000 tiny pieces. "We had a conversation," Eli said, his voice flat and noncommittal. "They were bothering the lady. I persuaded them to leave." "Persuaded them with a bullet in Slocum's partner's hand. Is that right?" Sheriff Brody asked. His eyes narrowed slightly. "And I hear you had another disagreement, shall we say, in the saloon in Prairie Ridge yesterday, with a local rancher." The town, the talk. It had already become a weapon against them. Clara felt a cold dread seep into her bones. She pushed the door open and stepped out onto the porch, her crutch thumping softly on the wood. "That man in the saloon was insulting me, Sheriff," Clara said, her voice clear and steady, though her heart was hammering. "Eli defended my honor, and those men on the trail, they were going to rob me, or worse. Eli saved my life." Sheriff Brody looked from her to Eli and back again. He was a man who seemed to see more than what was on the surface. "I understand, ma'am, but you have to see how this looks. A drifter is found dead, shot in the back, and the last man known to have a violent run-in with him is another drifter with a fast gun and a temper. The people in town are already spinning this into a tale of murder and collusion." Just then, another sound reached them, the rattle of a wagon and the murmur of voices. A small procession was making its way up the trail from town. In the lead was Beatrice, her face a mask of grim satisfaction. Beside her was Mr. Abernathy, looking uncomfortable but resolute. Behind them were several other townsmen, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and righteous anger. "There they are! Sheriff!" Beatrice called out, pointing a bony finger at the house. "That is him! The killer she has been harboring." Clara felt a wave of nausea. This was a witch hunt, and she was the witch. Eli was the demon she had summoned. "Now, hold on, Mrs. Prentice," Sheriff Brody said, turning to face the approaching crowd with an air of weary authority. "I am handling this." "Handling it?" Mr. Abernathy chimed in, emboldened by the numbers. "That man is a violent vagrant. He assaulted Silas Croft in broad daylight. Now a man is dead. He is probably hiding the murder weapon in her house right now. You have to search the place." The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective suspicion solidifying into a single, ugly voice. They were pressing in now, a wave of condemnation ready to crash down on her small, defenseless home. Clara looked at Eli. His face was a stone mask, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the almost imperceptible tightening of his hand near his gun. She saw the ghost of another courtroom, another rigged system, another unjust verdict in his eyes. This was it. This was the moment he would leave. He was a drifter. He could be on his horse and gone in minutes, over the ridge and lost to the world before the sheriff could even decide what to do. It was the smart thing to do, the only thing to do. Her heart broke at the thought, but she could not blame him. She saw the flicker in his eyes, the primal instinct to flee. He took a half-step back, toward the side of the porch, toward his horse. This was it. He was going. But then he stopped. He looked at the hateful, accusing faces of the townspeople. He looked at the weary, calculating face of the sheriff. And then he looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, the silent, desperate plea. He saw the woman who had shown him her scars, who had wept in his arms, who had found a small measure of peace in his presence. And in that moment, a choice was made. He straightened his shoulders and turned to face the sheriff. Planting his feet firmly on the porch, he was not running. He was staying. "You want to search the house, Sheriff?" Eli said, his voice calm and clear, ringing with an authority that silenced the crowd. "You go right ahead. We have nothing to hide." Clara could have wept with relief. The fear for her own safety was suddenly eclipsed by a fierce, protective pride. He was staying. He was standing with her. Sheriff Brody held up a hand to the crowd. "All right, that is enough. All of you, stay back. I will conduct my investigation in an orderly fashion." He turned to Eli and Clara. "I would like to ask you both a few questions, separately." The next hour was a quiet, nerve-wracking ordeal. The sheriff questioned Clara first, in her own kitchen, while Eli waited on the porch under the watchful eyes of the townsfolk. Sheriff Brody was polite but thorough. He asked about the attack on the trail, about Eli's arrival, about their relationship. Clara answered every question with a calm, unwavering honesty, her voice never faltering as she defended Eli's character and his actions. Then the sheriff sent her outside and called Eli in. From the porch, Clara could hear the low murmur of their voices, but not the words. She stood there, leaning on her crutch, enduring the venomous glares of her former neighbors. Beatrice looked at her with pure, triumphant hatred. This, to her, was justice for her brother's death, the final confirmation of Clara's inherent wickedness. Finally, the sheriff and Eli emerged from the house. Brody's face was unreadable. He had found nothing. Of course, no murder weapon, no stolen goods. Nothing to connect Eli to the dead man other than circumstance and gossip. "All right," the sheriff announced to the waiting crowd. "I have found no evidence of any crime on this property. My investigation will continue, but for now, Mr. He paused, looking at Eli. "Slade," Eli provided. "Eli Slade." "Mr. Slade is not under arrest," the sheriff finished. "Now, I suggest you all go on back to town and mind your own business." The crowd dispersed slowly, grumbling with disappointment. Their hopes for a quick and dramatic resolution had been dashed. Beatrice shot Clara one last look of pure poison before climbing back into her wagon. As they left, a new storm began to gather in the west, the sky turning the color of a fresh bruise. The silence that descended after they were gone was heavy and fraught. The immediate threat was gone, but the larger one remained. They were alone, together, in a world that had judged them both guilty. That night, the storm broke with a vengeance. Rain came down in solid, gray sheets, and thunder cannonaded across the sky. They ate a simple supper of bread and beans, the tension between them a palpable thing. The day had taken its toll. Clara felt drained, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. Eli was quiet, his stillness that of a man who had faced down a firing squad and was waiting for the next volley. After they had cleaned up, they found themselves drawn to the barn. The horses were restless from the storm, and the familiar, earthy smell of hay and animals was a comfort. They stood in the wide, open doorway, watching the lightning split the night sky, illuminating the rain-lashed landscape in stark, momentary flashes. The raw, pent-up emotion of the day, the fear, the relief, the anger, the profound gratitude, was a storm inside Clara, mirroring the one outside. She looked at Eli, his profile stark and handsome in the flickering lantern light. He had stayed. He had stood before the mob and the law, and he had not abandoned her. No one had ever done that for her. She reached out and laid her hand on his arm. He turned to her, his gray eyes searching her face in the gloom. All the fear and longing and desperation of her life seemed to well up inside her. And in that moment, she did not think. She acted. She rose up on her toes, her good leg taking her weight, and she kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was fierce and desperate and hungry. It was a kiss born of terror and relief, a raw, elemental collision of two people who had been pushed to the very edge. He responded instantly, his arms coming around her, pulling her tight against him as if he were afraid she might blow away in the storm. His mouth was hard and sure on hers, a kiss that answered her desperation with a powerful, claiming intensity of his own. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and dust and loneliness, a kiss that acknowledged all the unspoken things that had passed between them. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. The storm raged around them, but in the small circle of their embrace, there was a fierce, defiant calm. Clara looked up at him, her eyes shining in the lantern light. She pulled his head down to hers, her voice a ragged whisper against his ear, a plea that was also a promise. "Stay with me tonight," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I need to remember what safety feels like." He did not need to answer. He simply scooped her into his arms, her crutch falling unnoticed to the hay-strewn floor, and carried her to a clean, soft pile of hay in a secluded corner of the barn. He laid her down gently, his eyes never leaving hers. What followed was not a tempest of passion, but a slow, quiet unfolding. It was hesitant, emotional, filled with a sense of sacred discovery. For Clara, every touch was a revelation, a rewriting of the past. His hands on her skin were not violent or demanding. They were questioning, reverent. His mouth on hers was not bruising, but tender. He undressed her slowly, as if unwrapping a precious gift, and when he saw the scars on her shoulder again in the dim light, he paused to kiss each one, sealing them not with pity, but with a fierce, protective tenderness. She, in turn, explored the hard, lean landscape of his body, the corded muscles of his back, the old, faded scars that told their own stories of a hard-lived life. There was fear in their coming together, the fear of two wounded animals learning to trust again, to believe that they were capable of being wanted, of being touched, without it leading to pain. But there was a powerful current of release, too, the release of years of pent-up loneliness, of unspoken grief, of a longing so deep it had become a part of their very bones. It was a slow, quiet prayer, an affirmation in the heart of the storm that they were not broken, that they were not cursed, that they were, in this moment, whole. Afterward, they lay wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the rain drumming on the barn roof. The storm outside had begun to pass, and the one inside them had found a quiet peace. Eli stroked her hair, his fingers tracing the curve of her ear. "You do not need me to save you," he said softly, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "You are the strongest woman I have ever met." He paused, and she could feel the weight of his next words. "But I would stay anyway." At the first hint of dawn, another rider approached the house. It was Sheriff Brody. They met him on the porch, dressed and composed, the night in the barn a secret, sacred thing between them. The sheriff looked tired, but there was a faint look of respect in his eyes as he looked at them. "I thought you should know," he said, getting straight to the point. "We got a telegram from a marshal in Dodge City. Turns out that drifter, Slocum, had a $500 bounty on his head, wanted for armed robbery and murder. Seems most likely someone who knew about the bounty followed him out here and collected. It happens." He tipped his hat. "You are cleared. Mr. Slade, you are both free to go about your business." A wave of pure, unadulterated relief washed over Clara. It was over, but as Sheriff Brody rode away, the feeling began to curdle. She looked toward the town, still shrouded in the morning mist. The law had cleared them, but the town had already passed its own sentence. Her fears were confirmed later that day. She needed flour and salt, and with Eli walking beside her, she made the trip into Prairie Ridge. The moment they stepped onto the boardwalk, a chilling silence fell over the street. People turned their backs. Doors closed. Mothers pulled their children inside. The shunning was no longer just whispers and cold stares. It was absolute. When she walked into Abernathy's general store, the portly man stood behind his counter, his arms crossed, his face set like concrete. "We are closed," he said, his voice flat. The door was open, Clara said calmly. "Closed to you?" he clarified, his eyes like chips of ice. "I will not have my good customers driven off by the presence of a killer's companion. Take your business elsewhere." They walked out of the store, the silence of the street pressing in on them. They were outcasts. The law might have found them innocent, but the town had found them guilty of something far worse in their eyes, of being different, of not belonging, of finding solace in each other instead of in the community that had already cast them out. They were free, but they were more alone than ever. The days that followed settled into a new, fragile rhythm. Eli stayed. It was an unspoken, unnegotiated fact, as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. He told Clara he would help her prepare for the coming harvest, that a woman alone could not possibly manage the mending of fences, the clearing of fields, and the shoring up of the barn before the first snow. It was a practical excuse, a thin veil for the deeper truth. Neither of them knew how to say goodbye. He moved his bedroll from the floor by the hearth to the small spare room at the back of the house, a space that had been used for storage, filled with Jebediah's forgotten things. Clara helped him clear it out, packing away the last vestiges of her late husband into wooden crates that they stacked in the barn. The act was a quiet exorcism. With each object she passed to Eli, she felt another chain to her past breaking. His presence in the house became a simple, established reality. He was there when she woke, the smell of his coffee already filling the air. He was there in the fields, his steady, powerful movements a constant, reassuring presence at the edge of her vision. He was there in the evenings, sitting across from her at the small kitchen table, the lamplight casting a warm, intimate glow on his weathered face. Their romance deepened in the quiet spaces between the work. It was in the way he would pass her a dipper of cool water without her having to ask, his fingers brushing hers. It was in the way she would mend a tear in his shirt, her stitches small and neat, an act of care she had not felt free to give in years. They talked for hours, their conversations meandering from the practicalities of the day to the stories of their pasts, each one sharing small, carefully chosen pieces of themselves, like prospectors revealing flecks of gold panned from a deep and troubled river. Yet, for all their growing intimacy, a shadow of fear lingered between them. They were two people conditioned for loss, experts in the art of being left behind. Clara would watch him sometimes as he stared out at the distant mountains, his gaze far away, and a cold knot of anxiety would tighten in her chest. He was a drifter. His soul was restless. He had told her so himself. She loved the man who had stayed, but she was terrified of the man who had been riding through. Every sunset felt like a potential ending, every morning a temporary reprieve. She could not bring herself to ask him what he truly wanted, what his plans were, for fear that the question itself would remind him that he was not meant to have any. Eli, for his part, harbored his own deep-seated fears. He watched Clara move through her home, her quiet resilience a constant source of awe to him. He was a man with a violent past and a tainted name, a man who had brought a sheriff and a mob to her door. He felt the weight of the town's hatred as a burden he had placed upon her shoulders. He wanted to offer her a future, a life of peace and safety. But all he felt he had to give was his own brokenness. How could he ask her to tie her life to his, a life that had been nothing but a long, dusty road leading away from everything? He was afraid that if he spoke of staying, of permanence, She would see him not as a protector, but as a cage, another man trapping her in a life of isolation and trouble. This unspoken dread hung between them, a ghost at their table. They would fall silent in the middle of a conversation, a chasm of their shared anxieties opening up. They would touch, and the spark of desire would be there, but underneath it was a current of desperation, a need to hold on tightly before the other slipped away. One afternoon, Eli came in from the fields to find Clara sitting at the kitchen table, a piece of paper in front of her, a pen in her hand. She was writing a letter, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her lips were moving slightly as she formed the words in her mind. "What is that?" he asked gently, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. She looked up, startled, and a guilty flush spread across her cheeks. She tried to cover the paper with her hands. "It is nothing, just foolishness." He came and stood behind her, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. He read the first few lines. "To the Reverend Michael Blackwood," it began, "I am writing to you today as a member of your flock. Though I have not felt welcome in your church for some time, I wish to appeal to you, as a man of God, for a chance to speak my truth, to be granted a fair hearing before the eyes of the Lord and the community you lead." Eli's hand tightened slightly on her shoulder. "Clara," he said, his voice soft but laced with a deep sadness. "They will not listen." "I have to try," she whispered, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "I cannot live like this, Eli, judged and condemned without a trial. If I can just make them understand what Jebediah was, what he did, maybe they will see. Maybe they will grant me some peace." He did not argue with her. He simply squeezed her shoulder and went to wash up for supper, leaving her to her hopeful, painful task. He found her later that evening, standing by the fire pit behind the house. The sun had set, leaving streaks of orange and purple across the vast sky. She was staring into the flames, her face illuminated by the flickering light. In her hand was the letter. As he watched, she held it out over the fire. For a moment, she hesitated, her hand trembling. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry all the weariness in the world, she let it go. The paper curled, blackened, and was consumed by the flames, the words of her plea turning into smoke and ash that drifted up into the twilight. He saw a single tear trace a path through the grime on her cheek. She was giving up. She was accepting her exile. He came and stood beside her, not speaking, simply offering his presence as a silent testament. She leaned her head against his arm, and they stood there together, watching the last of her hope for redemption burn away into the night. The town's answer to her silent surrender came 3 nights later. They had finished their supper and were sitting in comfortable silence, Clara mending a shirt while Eli cleaned his rifle. The methodical click and scrape of the tools a soothing sound in the quiet room. A new moon offered little light, and the prairie outside was a vast, black ocean. The first sound was the distant, rhythmic drumming of hoofbeats, not one horse but several, moving together at a fast trot. Eli's head snapped up, his body instantly alert. He put down his tools and rose, moving silently to the window, peering out into the darkness. "What is it?" Clara asked, her mending forgotten in her lap. "Riders," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "A group of them, coming from town." A cold fist of fear clenched in Clara's stomach. She stood up, her heart beginning to pound. They watched from the window as the dark shapes of at least half a dozen riders pulled up 100 yards from the house, their forms silhouetted against the star-dusted horizon. They were just sitting there, a silent, menacing jury. Then, a single tongue of flame erupted from the group, followed a second later by the deafening crack of a rifle shot. Something whizzed past Eli's head, and the window on the far side of the room exploded inward, spraying glass across the floorboards. Clara screamed, a raw, terrified sound. Eli shoved her to the floor, covering her body with his own as another shot rang out, this one thudding into the thick log wall of the house. He had his Colt in his hand, and he fired 2 shots back into the darkness, not aiming to hit, but to warn. The riders let out a series of drunken whoops and hollers, fired 1 more wild shot into the air, and then spurred their horses, galloping back toward the safety and anonymity of the town. Silence descended, more terrifying than the noise. It was broken only by the sound of Clara's ragged, panicked sobs and the whistle of the wind through the shattered window pane. Eli helped her to her feet, his hands gentle, his face a grim mask of fury. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight. She shook her head, unable to speak. Her body was trembling uncontrollably. This was not shunning, this was not gossip, this was a declaration of war. They were not just content to see her isolated. They wanted her gone, or dead. The bullet had passed inches from where Eli had been standing. They had tried to kill him. The realization broke something inside her. The strength she had clung to for years, the calm facade she had so carefully maintained. It all shattered, just like the window. A wave of hysteria washed over her. It was all her fault. She was the cursed one. She was the Black Widow, and she had dragged him down into her own private hell. "You have to leave," she gasped, clutching at the front of his shirt, her eyes wild with terror. "Eli, you have to go, now!" "Clara, be calm," he said, trying to hold her steady. "No!" she cried, pushing at him. "Did you not see? They were shooting at you. They will kill you because of me. You have to leave this place. Go, please. I am begging you." She was sobbing openly now, her voice raw with a pain that was born not of fear for herself, but for him. "I cannot be the reason another man dies. I cannot." He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip firm, forcing her to look at him. "I am not leaving you," he said, his voice a raw, unshakable command. "Do you hear me? I am not leaving." "But they will kill you." "Let them try," he snarled, a dangerous light in his eyes. He released her and began to move with a swift, furious purpose. He took the heavy wooden table and jammed it up against the front door, barricading it. He found Jebediah's old tool chest and pulled out a hammer and nails, boarding up the broken window with planks he tore from a loose crate. His movements were angry, efficient, the actions of a man preparing for a siege. When he was done, he walked into the small spare room. Clara watched, her sobs subsiding into shuddering breaths, as he gathered his bedroll, his saddlebags, and the few other meager possessions he owned. He carried them into her bedroom and set them down on the floor at the foot of her bed. He walked back to the main room, picked up his rifle, and leaned it against the wall by her bedside. The act was a declaration more powerful than any words. He was not just staying in the house. He was moving into her life, into her room, into her last line of defense. He was tying his fate to hers, completely and irrevocably. He was her shield, her partner, her man. She stood in the doorway of her room, watching him, her heart aching with a mixture of terror and a fierce, overwhelming love. The world outside wanted to destroy them, but in this small, barricaded house, he was creating a sanctuary. He turned to her, his face grim but his eyes soft. He walked to her and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumb. He did not speak. He did not have to. That night, they came together again. But it was different from their first time in the barn. The fear was gone, burned away by the fires of defiance. The desperation had been replaced by a deep, soul-shaking tenderness. They made love with an intensity that was both fierce and freeing, a desperate, beautiful act of creation in the face of destruction. It was a claiming, a vow made with their bodies, a silent promise that whatever came for them in the morning, they would face it together. Every touch was a statement, every kiss a seal. They were no longer two wounded people seeking comfort. They were one, a united force against the darkness. Afterward, they lay in her bed, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the wind howl outside. The barricaded house felt like the only safe place in the entire world. Clara traced the line of his jaw in the darkness. her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "If we die tonight," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear, "I want to be yours." He pulled her closer, his lips finding hers in the dark. "You already are," he murmured against her mouth, "and I am yours." The morning came, pale and gray. They had not slept. They had simply held each other, watching the shadows retreat as the sun rose. There was no sign of another attack, but they knew it was not over. The town would be watching, waiting. Eli took down the barricade from the door. He and Clara dressed in silence. Then he took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a warm, solid anchor. Together, they walked out of the house and onto the front porch. They stood there, hand in hand, blinking in the morning light. They did not have to see the town to know the town was watching them. They could feel the weight of 100 unseen eyes from the distant ridge. The judgment carried on the wind. They were on display, the subjects of the town's morning gossip and speculation. Clara took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs. She felt Eli squeeze her hand, a silent message of support. She was not the trembling, terrified woman from the night before. She was not the shamed, silent widow. She was a woman who had been to the edge of despair and had found a reason to fight back. She lifted her chin, her voice ringing out in the clear morning air, strong and defiant, aimed at the unseen audience she knew was listening. "You judged me without ever asking," she called out, her voice carrying across the prairie. "You whispered about my husband's death, but you never once asked about my life with him. You hide in your houses and in your church, and you call it righteousness." She paused, taking another breath, her grip on Eli's hand tightening. "I would rather be alone with this one honest man than be surrounded by a town full of liars." Her challenge hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown down. They stood there for a long moment, a united front of two against the world, their faces turned toward the town, their hands clasped together, waiting for what would come next. Clara's challenge, shouted into the vast, indifferent prairie, received no immediate answer. There was no apology from the town, no further attack. There was only a profound and chilling silence. Her declaration had drawn a line in the dust, and they had chosen their side. The shunning was now complete. They were an island, a self-sufficient world of two, and as the days shortened and the vibrant colors of autumn bled from the landscape, they prepared for the long siege of winter. A harshness settled over the high plains that year, a winter that felt personal in its ferocity. The first snow came early, a thick, wet blanket that bent the branches of the junipers and buried the fence posts. It was followed by a relentless, razor-sharp wind that scoured the land and piled the snow into immense, impassable drifts. The trail to Prairie Ridge vanished. The town itself could have ceased to exist for all they knew. The world shrank to the four walls of their small log house, the barn, and the short, treacherous path between them. Their supplies, which had seemed adequate, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. The flour sack grew lighter, the coffee tin emptier. They rationed their food with a grim practicality, boiling potatoes for supper and saving the bacon for a Sunday treat. They survived on what they had stored, what they had prepared together in those final, frantic days of autumn. They were utterly, completely alone. And in that isolation, they discovered a new, deeper layer of intimacy. The long nights were a universe unto themselves. With the wind howling its mournful song outside, they would sit by the fire, the flickering light casting their shadows long and dancing on the walls. In this cocoon of warmth and quiet, they talked. They talked with an honesty and vulnerability that only such profound isolation could allow. They unpacked their lives for each other, piece by painful piece, laying their souls bare on the hearthrug. Eli spoke more of his brother, Daniel, not of the hanging, but of the boy himself. He told Clara about the way Daniel's laugh would echo across a canyon, about his foolish, hopeful dream of buying a small plot of land in California and growing oranges. He spoke of the suffocating guilt he still carried, the endless, looping question of what he could have done differently. "Grief is a ghost that walks beside you," he said one night, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Some days it is quiet, other days it shouts your name." Clara, in turn, spoke of the years with Jebediah. She did not dwell on the violence, but on the insidious, soul-crushing nature of his control. She spoke of the woman she'd been before him, a woman who loved to laugh, who dreamed of having children, who found joy in the simple miracle of a seed sprouting from the earth. She talked about how he had slowly, methodically, erased that woman, replacing her with a quiet, watchful shadow. "The hardest part was not the pain," she confessed, her voice a mere whisper. "It was the forgetting who I was, what I deserved, forgetting that a man's touch was not supposed to feel like a branding iron." They talked about the future, a concept that felt as distant and abstract as the moon. They spoke in hypotheticals, in hushed, hopeful whispers. They wondered if people could truly change, if a town's hatred could ever burn itself out, if two broken people could build something whole. Maybe a person cannot change what they are, Eli mused, staring into the flames. But maybe they can change what they do. Maybe that is enough. During these long, dark weeks, Eli began to carve. He had found a solid, beautifully grained piece of fallen cottonwood on their land before the snows came. Every evening, he would take out his pocket knife and, with a patient, focused intensity, he would work the wood. Clara would watch him, the soft scrape of the blade a comforting, rhythmic sound. She did not ask what he was making. The act of creation itself seemed to be the point, a small act of defiance against the destructive emptiness of the winter. He was pouring all his quiet concentration, all his unspoken feelings, into the small object taking shape in his large, calloused hands. One morning, they awoke to a world of absolute, blinding white. A blizzard had raged through the night, and now the sun was shining on a fresh, untracked canvas of snow. The silence was complete, profound. After their meager breakfast, as they stood by the window marveling at the stark, silent beauty of it all, Eli reached into his pocket. He did not speak. He did not go down on one knee. He did not make a grand pronouncement. He simply took her left hand in his. In his other palm lay a small, wooden ring carved from the piece of cottonwood. It was smooth and perfect, the grain of the wood swirling in intricate patterns. It was not a perfect circle, but slightly irregular, organic, like the life they were building together. He looked into her eyes, his own gray ones filled with a question he did not need to ask. A tear slid down Clara's cheek, hot against her cold skin. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, with a hand that was completely steady. He slipped the simple, perfect ring onto her fourth finger. It fit as if it had been made for her. It was not a proposal in words. It was a promise in substance, a commitment carved from the wood of their land, warmed by the fire of their hearth, and offered in the quiet truth of a winter morning. The winter finally broke. The great thaw came, and the prairie, which had been a frozen wasteland, slowly, miraculously, came back to life. The creek swelled with melted snow, and the first green shoots of grass pushed their way through the muddy earth. Life returned, and with it, the world beyond their small homestead. The first sign of trouble came as a faint, hazy plume of smoke on the western horizon. At first, they thought it was a weather cloud, but over the next few hours, the plume grew into a dark, roiling pillar that stained the sky. It was a wildfire. The dry spring grasses, fed by the wet winter, had created a tinderbox, and a spark from a passing train or a careless campfire had set it ablaze. The wind was blowing east, directly toward Prairie Ridge. They watched from their porch as the distant glow on the horizon intensified, the smell of smoke growing stronger, a bitter tang in the clean spring air. They could imagine the panic in the town. the frantic scramble to save homes and livestock. "The creek," Clara said suddenly, pointing to the winding ribbon of water that marked the northern edge of her property. "It is deep and wide from the thaw. It would act as a fire break." Eli looked at her, then at the fire, then back at her, already knowing what she was thinking. Her land, the very land the town had tried to drive her from, was now the safest place for miles. He saddled both horses without a word. He rode toward the fire, a wet burlap sack in his hand to beat back any stray embers that might cross the creek. Clara rode toward the town. She stopped on the ridge overlooking Prairie Ridge, the same ridge from which the townsmen had watched her home. She could see them now, figures running in the street, men shouting, women weeping. The fire was a monstrous orange beast now, cresting the far hill and starting its descent toward their homes. She took a deep breath and she screamed, her voice carrying on the wind, strong and clear. "Bring your animals to my land. The creek will hold back the fire. Bring your cattle and your horses to the north pasture." At first, no one seemed to hear her. Then a few figures stopped and looked up. They saw her, a lone woman on a horse, pointing toward the safety of her land. There was a moment of stunned, disbelieving silence. Then, a few of the ranchers, men who valued their herds above all else, began to move. Silas Croft, the man Eli had punched, was the first. He started driving his small herd of cattle out of their pen and toward the north. Martin Fletcher followed, then another, and another. Soon, a great, chaotic procession of panicked animals and desperate people was moving across the prairie toward Clara's property. She led them to the wide, flat pasture north of the creek, a sea of green grass that could sustain the animals for days. Eli was already there, his face black with soot, patrolling the creek line, putting out small flare-ups where embers had jumped the water. The townspeople did not speak to her. They avoided her eyes, their faces a mixture of shame, fear, and a grudging, resentful gratitude. They worked alongside her, their common enemy the fire, their common goal survival. They were a community again, not of friends, but of necessity. For 2 days and 2 nights, the fire raged along the far side of the creek. Eli and the other men worked tirelessly, never sleeping, their faces gaunt with exhaustion. Clara and the women, including a humbled and silent Mrs. Gable, tended to the animals, drew water, and kept a constant, fearful watch. Beatrice was not among them. She had apparently stayed in her home, trusting in God to protect her. On the 3rd day, the wind shifted, and a heavy spring rain began to fall. The fire was beaten back, its fury doused, leaving a great black scar upon the land. The town was saved. Slowly, awkwardly, the townspeople began to gather their herds to lead them back home. A few of them, as they passed Clara, mumbled a gruff, almost inaudible, "Thank you." Silas Croft stopped in front of her, his hat in his hands, his jaw still slightly crooked. He looked at the ground, then at his boots, then finally, briefly, at her face. We are obliged to you, ma'am," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Then he turned and hurried away. It was not forgiveness, it was not friendship, but it was a beginning, a small crack in the wall of hatred they had built. A week later, another rider came to their home. This time it was the Reverend Michael Blackwood. He was a tall, thin man who had always seemed 100 feet tall in the pulpit. But today, standing on her porch, he just looked like a tired, old man. Clara and Eli met him at the door. He took off his hat and held it crushed in his hands. "Mrs. Thompson, Clara," he began, his voice raspy. "I have come here today to ask for your forgiveness. I have been a poor shepherd to my flock. I allowed gossip and fear to take the place of Christian charity. I judged you without knowing your heart, and I led my congregation to do the same. What you did during the fire, it was an act of grace that we did not deserve." He looked past her, at Eli, who stood solid and silent at her side. "And you, sir, the preacher said. "I misjudged you as well. I see now that you are a man of honor and courage." He cleared his throat, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "I spoke with Sheriff Brody. He told me the full story of your late husband, the stories from his time as a younger man in Willow Creek. I was blind. I am deeply, profoundly sorry." He looked at their joined hands, at the simple wooden ring on her finger. "If you would have me, I would be honored to join you two in marriage, before God and the law." The wedding was 2 weeks later, when the apple tree behind the house had burst into a cloud of fragrant white blossoms. Clara did not wear a traditional gown, but a simple blue dress she had made herself, and over her shoulders she wore a plain, beautiful white shawl her mother had given her. The only attendees were Sheriff Brody, who had ridden over from Willow Creek to stand as Eli's witness, and a surprisingly contrite Martha Gable, who had asked to come and had brought a freshly baked apple pie as a peace offering. They stood under the blooming tree, the air sweet with the promise of new life. The Reverend Blackwood's voice was soft and sincere as he spoke the old, familiar words. When it came time for the vows, Clara turned to Eli, her eyes shining, her heart full to bursting. She reached up and touched the faint scar on his cheekbone, a permanent reminder of the day he had fought for her. "Thank you for staying that first night," she whispered, her voice for his ears alone. "I am not afraid to need someone anymore." He squeezed her hand, his thumb stroking the wooden ring he had carved. "There is nowhere else I would rather be," he murmured, his own voice thick with emotion. The story does not end there. Of course, life is not an ending, but a series of new beginnings. The town never fully embraced them, but the open hostility faded into a grudging respect. People began to nod at them on the street. "Mr." Abernathy started selling them supplies again. Beatrice Prentice eventually moved away, unable to bear living in a town that no longer echoed her own bitterness. The true ending, if there ever is one, was in the small, quiet moments. It was in the evenings, after a long day of work, when the sun would set and paint the sky in hues of rose and gold. Clara and Eli would walk out into the tall grass behind their home, the home they had built and defended together. He would take her in his arms, and they would dance, barefoot in the cool grass, to a silent music that only they could hear. And in the soft twilight, the scars of the past were still visible on her shoulder, a faint, silvery map of a life she had survived. But now, they were held by hands that no longer trembled, and they were kissed by a man who knew that true strength was not in the absence of wounds, but in the courage to heal them. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts.